Thank you, Bill. Welcome, everyone. It's a beautiful, a beautiful morning here. I'm working in my studio and looking, just to give you context, I'm looking at my bird boxes and this wonderful green belt I have behind my property in South Surrey, White Rock. Just for those who don't know me, I run an international practice. I work around the world. It's limited now with COVID to projects across Alberta and British Columbia. I also am uh, an adjunct professor at Simon Fraser University. And those of you who know me, I teach, and I was looking at last night as I was preparing, I was going, wow, I've taught 9 courses at SFU in the Urban Design Certificate Program. I'm a little bit quirky in that I also have led the Urban Development Institute's School of Development over the last 20 years, a very successful program of 3 courses. And I also am an adjunct professor at Vancouver Island University in their new, relatively new, Masters in Community Planning program. I come from a construction family, so today, and I'm a pracademic, so I have, and around me I have my 5 books that I've developed over the last 8 years or so. And one of them is EcoPlan, that is ecological planning and sustainable design. That sustainable word has evolved to resilient cities. What I want to do today, and you'll see here in my presentation, let's see here, we'll get this going somehow. It's frozen on me as we'll end show and we'll start it up again. There we are. So we'll start with the bad news. In other words, some wet blanket information that's really important, that relates to the Lower Mainland, from affordability through to infrastructure deficits, because these are really important in setting the stage as how important this green infrastructure is. Since I'm the first speaker in this series, I'd like to introduce you to the big picture, call it the macro structure of eco-cities. And I'm going to take you through not only my experience, and I had the fortune to work with the city of Vancouver as their first senior landscape architect in the 90s. They called them the golden years because we did a lot of stuff. I'm going to take you through the greenways plan that I led and developed with my greenways team at the city of Vancouver. I'll then take you into Southeast Falls Creek. You might have heard about it. It's the first LEED Platinum neighborhood in Vancouver. I'll take you into a world competition that I was involved in China that we actually won. We went up against the big guys, and I'll show you a whole city structure. We developed 7 systems. And then finally, I'll bring us home to suburbia, and a development that's gone on for 15 years now. I did the neighborhood plan and monitored it. That is Garrison Crossing in Chilliwack, that relates to Maple Ridge in terms of its suburban context. And throughout my presentation, I want to relate to Maple Ridge. In other words, some of these examples because these are tools that can be applied, and they're macro tools and micro tools. So I'll talk about the bad news. I'll talk about 2 big ideas. I call them net community gain, net environmental gain. I'll take you through the 3 case studies so we can start applying this. I'll come back to 6 uniform and universal eco-plan principles that you can apply to Maple Ridge. And we'll finish with what I call measuring Maple Ridge eco-plan performance. It's a scorecard, a resilient city scorecard that I've developed that has four major components and 19 subunits. So away we go. So one of the things I always point out is that we can't afford to do the same thing again. Across Canada, we're running a $2 billion deficit, $200 billion deficit in terms of replacing the roads and infrastructure we have in place. So we have to find different ways to build our cities. For instance, Canberra, Australia, has decided to build no more roads. And so there's some big moves that cities are making. And as you'll see, Vancouver has inverted the pyramid in terms of transportation planning. In other words, they start with the pedestrian and they end with the single occupancy vehicle. And if we start with thinking about pedestrian local resident space first, and we move to, and we think about mobility, that is moving people, not cars, you move to a wholly different organized city. Climate change. One of the things that's interesting, recently I was reading a book on climate change, and this caught me. 2016 was the hottest year on record. In other words, thermometers don't lie. At the same time, we've got this greenhouse gas challenge, this climate emergency we're dealing with, and 80% of greenhouse gases come from cities. We also have an affordability challenge, crisis, emergency. Actually, Vancouver ranks second in the world in terms of least affordable city behind Hong Kong. It has 11.9 ratio between salary and house prices. And that's the huge sort of division. In other words, a house price compared to a person's salary. Let's say a person makes $60,000 on average, a family income. They need, essentially, there's a difference of 11.9. So multiply that by 12, you get something like, if you multiply it by 10, you get 600, something like $700,000. But when we look at Vancouver in 1990, in the region, it was an average in Vancouver of $300,000 for housing, for a house. Now it's in excess of 1 million. What's that forced? And I've been monitoring that over the last year, 2 years. There are graphs in Vancouver. You can go to their housing policy, where in fact there's an out migration. It's forcing people to move out. Maple Ridge, Township of Langley, up the Whistler corridor. There's a force there. Now the pandemic has further exaggerated that. So what's happened in terms of housing form, over the last 10 to 15 years, if you look at CMHC data, it's started to blow up that townhouse multi-unit to that is what I'm calling the townhouse is the new single family home because of affordability. And we've known and developed in the Lower Mainland this aspect of great design in terms of compact units. And as we'll go through, I'll talk about that further. Look at the district of Saanich, something I'm working over in the island on a number of projects. And it came upon this, which is just amazing. Over the last 25 years, the district of Saanich, which surrounds the city of Victoria, has lost 25% of their tree canopy. And meanwhile, the tree canopy has declined. Meanwhile, impermeable surfaces have nearly increased by 40%. So you see in the top diagram there that as the diagram moves from, the tree canopy moves from, call it west or the left side of the page to the east, it gets lighter. So the tree canopy in this GIS database has shown that the loss of 25%. Meanwhile, the bottom diagram, as you see initially in the early 90s, 1986 actually, they had a 49% coverage in terms of sort of permeable surface. That's decreased. That is the amount of pavement and roads and coverage on properties have increased. So not only have we lost the tree canopy, in so doing, we've increased the permeable surface and the heat island effect, those of you who know that in the city. So we can either, at this point, we can either be in denial, and many people are saying, we don't have an issue. What's the problem? We've got lots of trees. Lots of open space, especially I'm sure in Maple Ridge. Look at all that ALR we have surrounding our city. Look at all the trees we have. Why do we have to have trees, that many trees in the city? They just get in the way of development. And you see here, for the first time in human history, in terms of air quality, we're breathing air with 400 parts per million of carbon dioxide. And that, as you know, when you start to affect air quality, and sometimes we don't see it in the lower mainland. Sometimes after a few days, you see that brown haze. But the interesting thing, the most poisonous air you can't see. So that's one of those things. Those of you, I've spent some time in Beijing and Shanghai working on different projects. And there in Shanghai, they have a yellow haze. You can't even see the sun. And in Beijing, on those smoggy days, which are most days, it has a gray haze. So you feel like you're on a different planet. And that is an alienscape that I don't want Canada to experience. So much for the bad news. Let's move to the healthy plans. And there's a combination. Sometimes people tend to alienate, oh, green infrastructure, oh, ecology. Isn't it nice to have green stuff out there? We want to bring it in as part of a resilient city strategy, combining the economic prosperity with environmental health. And as you'll see, it affects employee productivity. And with that, you bring a social diversity, inclusiveness, and safety into the city. So we have to invite the environment as part of this green infrastructure back into our cities, because we have, even in suburbia, we've pushed it out. We tend to treat it as, oh, nature is out there, there's the park, versus nature to the center, nature, the canopy over our heads as we walk to work or as we work at home. Very, very important. So how do we accomplish this? Well, if we work with building and land use, we can decrease greenhouse gas and transportation by another 40%, 40, and we can get to our target of -80 using those innovative compact land uses, green building, and innovative transportation mobility. We can get to those targets. So two big ideas: net environmental gain and net community health gain. What do I mean by that? I simply say, let's say a developer comes to Maple Ridge, said, well, we want to do a great high-rise development. We're going to do compact development and all that stuff. Well, my first question, if I was city administrator, is saying, oh, so what community benefits are you going to provide to Maple Ridge in terms of economic, ecological, that is the environment, and on social side? So those benefits, if they aren't creating a net gain in those areas, why should they come to Maple Ridge? And it's what I call a positive no or a conditional yes. And that's what we have to start doing. So how do we do that? Let's start looking at Vancouver. I spent 10 years as their senior landscape architect and senior planner. I was privileged to work on anything from transit through to their greenways and so forth. And its goal in 2020 to become the greenest city in the world. Let's look at what they've done. First and foremost, very important, let's look at the eco-city, what I call the macro structure. In 1993, I was asked to develop the city's greenways plan. And it's interesting, we developed at the time 14 city greenways. You see those in yellows on the map. And this was done to Maple Ridge side. We wanted to create a green superstructure to the city. How did we do that? We had 6 workshops where I actually had university students working with me. I was much younger at the time, but still teaching at UBC at the time. And we brought in city planning and landscape architecture students to actually digitize 128 maps that were done at these 6 workshops across the city. What we found was this, was a whole network and we asked them to actually draw where they walked and biked and where their special places were. By overlaying these 128 maps, we created this superstructure, call it active transportation superstructure, that eventually formed this, as you see here, 210 kilometers of city greenways and numerous other connected neighborhood greenways. The very two important points here is our goal was to create a greenway within a 10-minute walk or a 5-minute bike ride of every resident. And you can see here in the grid system, it starts to bring the city down to a smaller scale and and it connects it by water, by streets. Interesting enough, one of the big surprises as I presented this with my team to administration, David Rudberg at the time, city engineer, said, "Michael, what do you mean by greenways? 50% of what you're proposing are on my streets." And that was one of those things we were inventing at that point. This is the 1990s. People didn't even know what tree bylaws were at the time. But over time, we've developed a whole street and pathway system that interconnects the city, that creates that superstructure or green infrastructure to the city. You can see here the Central Valley Greenway concept. This is a drawing I did early on. It has a whole social fabric to it as well as an environmental fabric. And notice the double row of trees. That doubles the canopy along a street. And I'll show you another case study in downtown South of Vancouver where we used it. And all of a sudden you've got 100% more coverage of leaves. And as we know, trees are the lungs of the city. They take in carbon dioxide, they release oxygen, and that is an air cleaner. So let's look at the eco-city anatomy. That's the macro structure. Let's look at a microstructure, an example. And this is Olympic Village in Vancouver. This is now 15 years in the making, so to speak. So let's look at it in detail to see how it's performing. As many of you know, it's one of the LEED Platinum neighborhoods in North America. In other words, wow, this is, and talk about a high level of experimentation. And keep in mind, this was built for the Olympics. It had, it wasn't without controversy, but the results are interesting. And I've observed it a number of times with my SFU students where we've walked it, we've talked about it. Let's look at this former industrial area. And those of you who know this area, prior to its development, I used to live up the street, and this was just a dark industrial area that was the backwater of Vancouver. And even Falls Creek had this, the old Cambie Street Bridge was a wood trestle bridge that I used to walk across in the early 80s. I lived in Fairview Slopes. So this has just transformed. Let's look at the elements of transformation and how those, call it green infrastructure elements, could add to Maple Ridge. Well, this is poop to energy, where they use a local waste system to actually provide 70% of the space heating and hot water in Olympic Village, with the remainder provided by a high efficiency gas boilers on the coldest day of the year. You might have noticed those vertical elements when you're on the Cambie Street Bridge. Those light up at night, and so when that energy from waste facility is working, as you see in the bottom right-hand corner. This reduces greenhouse gases by 60%. So again, an experimentation for Maple Ridge, maybe an example to move forward. Green roofs, something when I was at the City of Vancouver and I was looking at development applications as they came in, we said, we do not want just gravel on roofs. You have many medium rise and high rise buildings coming even into Maple Ridge. We said, we want those planted. In other words, there's two types of green roofs, extensive and intensive, depending on the building, but we said, like, green them up. And so even by 2010, there was 400 green roofs in Vancouver. So that's an area, especially in terms of overlook. it creates that green overlook. Let's say it's high rise to mid rise in Maple Ridge. You all of a sudden create a greenscape from above that has both a visual aesthetic and a functional aesthetic. And as you see here, rainwater recirculate for toilets and irrigation reduces water use by an estimated 50%. So in other words, it's a rainwater recovery program within the system that is working in Southeast Falls Creek. Transportation. Well, look at this, 60% less auto trips. I commend you to visit this community because you'll see it. And it was originally planned as a high-rise development. They went to more compact form. In other words, I'm a real advocate of intermediate density. In other words, between 4 to 6 stories, you can get 100 units an acre or 250 units per hectare. You can get all sorts of density. It's more a European model, which they used in Southeast Falls Creek. And people are more connected to the sidewalks, to their communities, because it's a lower compact form. Well, anyway, they reduced parking requirements. Actually, Edmonton over the last, I think 3 months ago, eliminated parking requirements in their downtown. We know in Maple Ridge that's sensitive. It's a suburban environment, and there's a requirement for cars, but reducing the number of cars, as you say, reduced parking requirements to 0.5 space per unit for unit less than 50 square meters. Commercial space, they also reduced. At the time, it was radical. This is also only 400 meters from the Canada line, that is the transit system. So it's about a 5 to 10 minute walk. There's a number of car share programs and car co-op programs within these buildings. So if people don't have a car, they can easily get one in their building. And what we've found, I've worked on a number of developments that had a car share program, that when people move from, let's say they downsize from a large house to an apartment, a condominium, they normally, they use their second car about 15% of the time. So they rid themselves of the second car. They then have this new Prius, or let's say an electric car, that they can use as a second car within their apartment complex. So it's very important to not only be electric car ready, but actually have car share programs within your higher density developments. Also in Southeast Falls Creek, they have the luxury of having a ferry dock and the aqueduct on Falls Creek. And there's a bikeway and pedestrian system linked into the bigger greenway system that I talked about. And just a little detail, when you're planning your trails and pathways, I was a lot younger at the time, and I remember even in the early 80s, I was working with Dave Podmore in BC Place, and we required a 10-meter setback for the trail, for the pathway system that divided bicycles and pedestrians along the waterfront. The engineering department was arguing, Michael, why do you need more than 3 meters? We'll give you 3 meters. It won't be continuous along the waterfront. And I said, 2 things. We need 10 meters and we need to be continuous along the waterfront. Could you imagine if we had a 3-meter walkway? We needed that so we can expand, like Maple Ridge, to a larger population that are walking and biking instead of in their cars. Urban agriculture. Food resilience is a huge issue now. And you see in the bottom right-hand corner, the photograph I took was interesting. This is a community garden that's near the waste to energy, energy from waste facility. And I noticed this young boy stopping, and I was wondering, I had just come out of the transit station. I was walking towards Southeast Falls Creek to photograph. And I noticed he had stopped with his mom, and he was saying, Mom, look at these butterflies. That this community garden had attracted all sorts of insects and wonderful, colorful butterflies. And he was fascinated by the beautiful, I think it was a monarch butterfly that had landed on one of the sunflowers. So the greening spaces brings all sorts of, and Maple Ridge, I always caution suburban communities, be careful of what you attract because, you know, there's bears and other larger mammals that you don't want to attract into your town center. But at the same time, you can see a wonderful array. Diversity, biodiversity is so important in terms of planting and food sustenance. So in your more compact communities in Maple Ridge, please require the aspect of community gardens, because people still need and love to commune around these spaces. And this is an active element in Southeast Falls Creek. The idea of historic conservation, the Salt Building, which is now the Brew Pub, a wonderful meeting place. So as you get more compact and bring green into your community, also those social places are hugely important as a community benefits program. And then finally, alternative street standards. If you go into Southeast Falls Creek, they've put the streets on a diet. They're more pedestrian, more, you've heard the term vernerf, which is living street. In other words, it's a traffic calming mechanism. So one of the things in Maple Ridge, consider outside the arterial system, your local streets can be much more livable and safe by first narrowing them. Still, the capacity to park is that's part of the slowing mechanism. And then planting, as you'll see with double row trees. The eco parks and public art in Southeast Falls Creek, I'm not sure if you're familiar with that. It's super important. Besides the community gardens, they've really naturalized a part of the area in terms of stormwater management and natural waterfront transition. They actually created a new island to help clean up and restore Falls Creek. And 10 years ago, for the first, I think it was 8 to 10 years ago, for the first time in a in decades, a whale came up into Falls Creek. So again, that's an indicator of environmental performance, that there is food in the creek now, in Falls Creek, and that it's cleaning through these developments and through various initiatives. It's actually cleaning up the water so that nature can come back and flourish. Also, finally, you know, the LEED building program, the community center is a LEED platinum building, again at the highest end. One thing I say to my students about healthy buildings is, normally when you come into them, you notice the natural wood. There's no toxicity in the air, and normally there's fresh air and natural light. Those are the two indicators for me that it's a high performing building. And what they've noticed in high performing buildings, that the employees like coming to work and they perform at a higher level. So this plays to the employers. In other words, green buildings makes a more productive environment and a higher return on investment. So let's now go to the second case study. And this was an incredible challenge done. Could you imagine this? Redesigning an extension of an existing city of about 350,000 in China. And what we did was create 7 healthy city systems. As you'll see here, at a macro structure level, this is 450 square kilometers. And our approach was a 50-50 green space balance with development. And you see it here. So on the north side, there was a series of pockets of development. In Maple Ridge, you have the ALR surrounding the community, which in part reflects the same, what I call green framework. But you also have to bring green, as you'll see in the city center that we designed. Green is part of that 50-50 balance. Let's look at it. So as we came in to the city center and started to analyze it, normally you respond with a classic city grid. In other words, you come across and, oh, so what about the natural forms? But those forms are organic and they have purpose. So as we expressed, as in this first drawing I did, or second drawing, we came in with a classic grid. Then I said, let's follow this organic pattern. That is the high points and the low points, and let's develop inflow with the landscape. And you can see here is the final product, but I want to quickly go through the 7 healthy systems approach. In other words, you'll see here, we looked first at, behind this green infrastructure look, we had a complex land use system. And you can see, like at the macro level, like at the city of Maple Ridge, you have creeks coming through the community. You have that green superstructure or green belt articulated by the Agricultural Land Commission, the ALR. And here, we're not only creating a green superstructure, but we're balancing jobs and housing. At the top, you see 150,000 jobs and 150,000 residents. So this is 12 square kilometers. And we're bringing water into it, we're bringing green into it as the lifelines in the community. So the ecosystem is part of the green and economic structure. So let's look at the first layer. This is the green corridor system. So you can see the valleys that were natural, the high points are outside that, became sort of that 50% green superstructure between waterfront parks, the promenade, the canal pathways, and these, we created canals, you'll see in the water system, canals which are traditional to China, as a system of moving around. And you see the civic center in the center of the community with the mass transit system to the western edge. I mentioned the double row of trees. This is Vancouver. In downtown South, we created a 4-meter setback for new high density development. And I remember at the time, Parks Department said, what are you doing? It's not going to work because half the trees are going to be on private property and half we're going to manage. It's not going to work. Well, here you can see it. We doubled the trees, doubled the canopy. That's 100% increase. And you can see along these streets in downtown South, I'm sure many of you walk them, that they've become walking promenades. They become a social function in the community. Let's go to the second level. The water self-cleaning system. This was a big idea. Again, counterintuitive. At the time, I said, well, we have to think big or go home because we're going up against Sasaki and Associates, all the big consulting firms. I was working with the Guangzhou Planning Institute, which is a firm of 1,000 employees in southern China. And we created these drawings essentially on, it was 6 weeks. So on Air Canada, back and forth, sending slides, we created these systems. And this was the water system. You can see the self-cleaning system where we circulated the water within the community up through these canals. We aerated it in the lower part, and you can see it with my arrow in the start of the bay. We encircled the bay with a barrier system because we wanted to clean the water of this city sector to eventually expand and clean the lake. So think of ecosystems as, I call it a reverse domino effect. Rather than degrading, we want to create, remember that net environmental gain. We want to clean the city to clean the region. And here you see the water filtering system, the flow here, the aeration levels, the planting islands that would clean the water and recirculate it up through these canals. And then the third system was the air conditioning system. The air came off the lake. Dai Lake actually is a large lake that flows into the Yangtze in Mideastern China. So we wanted to take, again, the natural wind flow and off the lake to clean the air in the cities, in this particular new sector of the city, using plants to also filter it, etc. So like in Frankfurt, Germany, they use greenways to filter the air comes off the mountains into the center city, and it actually cleans out the air during the evenings. So these greenways have multiple functions, both to water filters, air filters, and great social and transportation mobility functions. You can see here there's 6 layers to our mobility system. And you say, wow, how does that work? And you can see it starts, again, you see that pyramid in the southeast corner there, starts with the pedestrian network in terms of the 5 to 10 minute walk, which is 400 meters. And those are those circles. Within 400 meters, the elementary schools, and within 800 meters, the high schools. Connected to that super green structure, you can see the pedestrian network, the bicycle network, local tram system, the urban bus network, and then moving up to the high-speed train, which connects Guangzhou with Beijing. This is a 300-kilometer-an-hour train system. This major station is actually built now, and a whole network that feeds from this station into the community. So again, a walk-first community is very important. The 5th system, low energy and waste, you're familiar with. Again, a district energy system like that of Southeast Falls Creek, complemented by a thermal energy delivery. That is a geothermal exchange system that together create a local energy system that is sustainable. A green building system is hugely important. These are 2 projects that I worked on, one in White Rock, one in actually Alberta, and emphasizing that idea of site planning with nature, bringing nature into the development, open space and plazas, fresh air, natural materials, and the aspect of natural light, hugely important. And then finally, the 7th system. This is a fascinating map that I put together. It's called Special Places. And if we hark back to the Greenway system in Vancouver, we said, oh, to the community through 6 workshops, about 150 to 160 participants, we said to them, where do you walk? What are your special places? And here you can see that the green infrastructure is connected to those special places in the community. They've actually built the sports center and the stadium. The idea of a whole waterfront superstructure system, from a convention center to waterfront Grand Park to the hotels, and then into the civic center and into the micro, from the high schools to the elementary schools, all connected in this green network and through a green streets system. So again, resulting into this diagram, within 6 weeks, we produced, and I give full credit to the Guangzhou Planning Institute, we created a 20-minute video, a 200-page hardcover book, a 60-page summary, and the interesting thing, when I made the final presentation, they said, well, we have 30 minutes. And I said, well, how much time do we have? And I said, 30 minutes? They said, well, 20 minutes will be for the video, and you have 10 minutes to present. And I said, no, I have 5 minutes, because my colleague had to translate to Chinese. So I presented the whole plan in 9 slides. And the good news is we won the competition. But I learned a lot through the process. So now let's come back to bringing it home to suburbia. You say, well, Michael, that's China. The other one's Vancouver. Vancouver is Vancouver. But let's now come out to the valley and look at a development I worked on over the last, I developed the neighborhood plan in 2003, and now it is built. This is Garrison Crossing. I'm sure many of you know it, and you most might say, who did this and how was it evolved? Well, if you look at convention development, this is 150 acres. It's the former Canadian Forces Base in Chilliwack. It's on the way. It's in Sardis, just on the south side by the Veta River. And when I walked it in 2002, before we got the job, I said to my wife and young daughter, I said, wow, I need some time here. because there was some great character. And remember, I talked about the organic forms even in China that we followed. Well, look at the organic form of streets here. You could call it a modified grid, but we wanted to work within the existing street structure, and we wanted to actually retain as many of the permanent married quarters as possible. And you would say, well, that's crazy. How do you do that? Let's just bring in the graders on 150 acres and just wipe it out, and we'll start over, coming in with suburban sprawl development. But look at the stats here. We said we are going to, I worked with Mark Ankerman Architects, and we had a small team that said, let's find what makes this tick. So one of those things with green infrastructure, we have to identify those elements on a site that are most valuable. And as we know, with the creek system running through Maple Ridge, those are part of the incredible sort of natural green infrastructure that we have to build around and nurture and clean the water in the process. In this particular case, we didn't have a creek, but we had, you can see in the center, we call it the tree park. Well, that was reclaimed. Again, it was overused, but a really important element for the community. We worked with focus groups, former families in on the base. Michael J. Fox actually spent his earlier years here. The former mayor also grew up on this base, so it had many memories of important things. And for instance, the boulevard you see here, many of the trees we retained many of the trees in this area. They were very important features to the community. And then building on the existing parks that were in place, we built on that green infrastructure that was already in place. We retained the existing street structure, you'll see. And in so doing, we increased the diversity of housing. Who would think in 2005 that anyone would propose 75% multifamily units? That's what, in our initial market study in the early 2000s, said, oh, 75% single family and 25% multifamily. Well, guess what is built? It's 75% to 80% multifamily. There's a whole diversity and choice of units, from single to duplex, to 3-story buildings, to a number of strata titled developments. So there's a whole sort of diversity with rich green infrastructure. And interesting, we created a stormwater scepter system that cleans the water, and that system is built under this park. We had many negotiations with the city of not Vancouver, it's Chilliwack, about water management. Initially, they wanted to take all the stormwater and then take it in pipes down to the Veta River. Instead, we proved a local cleaning system, and this is over the city of Chilliwack aquifer, which is hugely sensitive. And so from a water management standpoint, we convinced them because there wasn't any stormwater subsurface significant system on site. So we wanted to bring in a system that cleaned the water through a number of filters, call it sand filters, and then recharge the soil in a true, similar to rain gardens, where we keep the water on the site. We have no impacts outside. So that was very important. So you can see here, as we go through, again, I apologize. Naturally, we took the before picture on a rainy day, and we took the after picture with rainy day in the fall, and the after picture is in the summer. But you can see how before and after in the northeast corner, one of our first phases, that we retained the structure, the trees, and we call it retrofitted, infilled, again, 4 times the existing density by infilling units in between and retrofitting the existing buildings where we could. This is an assortment of the diversity and choice of housing that I think is very important. As I pointed out, we have an affordability challenge, if not crisis, in the Lower Mainland. So diversity and choice is part of the way to affordability. So you can see here the refurbished PMQs, the duplexes, single family, townhouse, refurbished row houses. We provided coach houses. This is in the early 2000s. People were saying, what are these coach houses? Well, they are mortgage helpers, and they are part of the smaller unit affordability within your community. And then the 3 to 4 story, and now up to 6 stories that they're recently building. This is Garrison Village, and just to focus on retaining the green infrastructure, existing trees. This south corner here, I spent a weekend negotiating with this shopping center developer to move their center over here so we could retain this incredible legacy of trees that were on the site. They wanted to put their shopping center here in the south portion, take the trees out, put a big parking lot right on the street. We said, well, we'll shift you over to Vetter to give you more exposure. You can share the parking. Parking sharing is very important. Share the parking both for the retail on the ground floor of this residential and mixed use Main Street with the parking for your shopping center. That negotiation was worthwhile because it created, if you've been to Garrison Village, it's a nice mix with not overwhelming huge parking lots. We created parking courts, not parking lots, with trees in them. So there was canopy and there were smaller units of parking. This here is the Shiam Center, which was a joint venture with the city of Chilliwack. We refurbished this regional asset and brought parking in close and wrapped it with housing. So this is again in the early 2010 and so forth. This was very innovative, especially with the multi-unit housing and the diversity connected. Again, all residents are connected between 5 and 10-minute walk to this commercial village, which is mixed use. So finally, let's finish up. What have we learned? Well, fit with the context, really important, and flow with the land. And that's, really important in environmental planning. It's organic and it's messy. Oh, I have trees on my property. And I managed the tree program in Vancouver and developed the tree, refined the tree bylaw there. And if I had to play it back, it's really about the values in the community, that trees are really important rather than using legislation. But sometimes I find frequently with developers, and half my clients are developers, they say to me, what do we absolutely have to do? So that regulation of tree retention, replacement, or relocation is really important. Normally, I don't use the word removal. That's not within my vocabulary, because we want to have a net gain of green in our communities. We want to manage that resource use locally, both the water resource and so forth. We want to recycle it, reuse, whether it be on-site rainwater as a resource for irrigation, etc. We want to recycle, reuse. We want to create flexibility to optimize quality. So if you have an idea to work with a developer to cluster something, to retain trees, to modify street standards a bit, again, within reason, depending on the location, that's very important. Setting targets. I'm going to move through that towards the end, just in another 5 minutes. As I mentioned, housing choice is very important. Multi versus single. The new multis, obviously, there's a pressure for multifamily development. I see it all over Maple Ridge, where the townhouse is the new single family home. So water, waste, and energy should be managed locally. So sustainability is not enough. When I say that, we need to revitalize, restore, and re-energize. So that net environmental gain is hugely important. So let's look at 6 final eco-plan principles. What are some simple ones? Create a positive difference. We're normally, our vocabulary is normally, well, let's mitigate the impact. Let's minimize the impact versus create a positive. Let's recycle that to create actually a positive gain. Every development should create a positive gain for Maple Ridge. We want to connect to our surroundings. Simply there, we want to, urban design is about context, context, and context. In other words, the surrounding community should have an influence on developing the form, character, and natural components of development. We want to balance nature with development. My aggressive strategy, you saw, was 50-50 if you're at the macro level. Number 4, we want to use the natural landscape elements that are in place, the forest, the water features, the wetlands, as value added elements. Again, what I've learned is those amenity edges get the premium prices for land. So they are not a depreciating factor, they're an improvement and appreciation factor for development. Make natural connections. And that's super important. Nature loves to be connected. From a proven biotic standpoint is, from a mating standpoint for wildlife and so forth, they need to be connected. So rural has to be connected to urban, right to its center. Let's bring nature downtown with water, streets, and forests. And then save a large natural area if possible. That creates critical mass for nature to really nurture itself. And sometimes you want that to be private for nature. In other words, those nesting areas and so forth are hypersensitive. So the scale is also very important. So in essence, we want to create a high performance community, quality of life, healthy, live, work, and learn, and high economic returns, because you will attract those people in the lower mainland are saying, let's move to Maple Ridge because they have a high quality of life. It's healthy, it's safe, and that's where I want to live. Finally, I want to come to this element of the Sun scorecard. We've seen checklists in various municipalities of saying, and I'm working in Maple Ridge right now in the Yenandun area, and I'm delighted to work with staff. They're just a joy to work with. And we're trying to create, again, balance that environment with actually a local employment area where people can walk and bike to work. But here you see the difference in this scorecard, rather than just a checklist, is that on the left-hand side, it has 4 major elements. On the right, it has sustainable, you can say resilient goals, but it has 3 comparisons. And this is very important. We have to benchmark where we want to be. It has a super green performance, it has business as usual, and then it has, it's called Campbell Heights. This is a development in Alberta, but it has a benchmark of saying, how does this proposed development compared to business as usual and super green? It might be somewhere in between, or it might be actually super green, but we don't want to be less than business as usual because that's suburban sprawl. So on the left-hand side, we see carbon, transportation, land use, which is the first component. Under that, there could be a number of elements: compact, mixed use, walkable, connected to surrounding areas. So these are all measurements of performance: reduce car dependency, green streets, and parking. So these all have goals to it. They have a super green measurement. They have a business as usual measurement. And then they have what the developer recommends. So council in this instance will know where it lands on the spectrum of being green. Otherwise, we don't really know where it fits in terms of performance. The second one, materials, waste, and energy. Does it use alternative energy? Is there a green building standard? What about the sanitary process and solid waste process? Those could be conventional. Third, water, food, natural habitat. What about the stormwater management? What about habitat enhancement? Community gardens, maximizing public green. What are they doing and how are they measuring? When you say maximizing public green, for instance, super green is 2.75 acres per 1,000 population in terms of green space. We sometimes just have a 5% dedication. how does that relate to the development, and how are they going to service that? And finally, well-being, equity, and culture. The big news, as we know now, is inclusion. How do we include all races? How is that equity? How do we provide equity and invite everyone into our community? That's housing choice, commercial development. Are you providing local commercial, community facilities, and a strong sense of place and culture? Add those 19 elements up under those 4 boundaries, and you have something to qualify the development. And we come back to that final thing of net environmental gain and net community gain. So in summary, start with environmental footprint, incorporate social and economic targets, balance density with social amenities, really important, balance jobs with housing locally if you can, focus on transit-oriented development. So finally, the best community system in terms of a high eco-city IQ, which is hugely important. We want to use less energy. We want to create less waste or zero waste if we can by recycling, etc., by the 3 R's. We want to create, we want to use less water, and we want to drive the cars less. What we want more of is a high air quality, thermal comfort in terms of warmth and comfort in an area. We want more natural light. We want to invite nature in. We want to create more compact density. It's not necessarily high rise, but a scale that fits Maple Ridge. We want to have local, multiple modal transit. In other words, we want to connect walking to bicycling, to rapid bus, to eventual light rail transit, and we want to create a walking community first. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. That was amazing. A lot to think about, that's for sure. Just a comment, I think, overall. I know that in Maple Ridge we have concerns about what we can and can't do.
Yes.
I'll make available a presentation as well that was done by the Michael Van Hausen of Melbourne, Australia, who's been working with Melbourne for 30 years. And Melbourne has been voted the most livable city for like 7 years running.
Yes.
And you know, just talking about one of Michael's points, car density, I posed the question to him: how did you manage to eliminate street parking, add larger sidewalks and trees and everything? Like, didn't you get pushback? And he says it was really easy, actually. He says 30 years ago we started with a big, bold plan.
Mm-hmm.
And then we did things incrementally, very slowly. And he said we had no pushback because nobody noticed.
Yes.
We did things so slowly and so methodically and a little bit at a time.
Yes.
So in our thinking about Maple Ridge, we're not talking about something here where we have to turn a switch and do this tomorrow. But the time to start thinking about these things is now. That's why this subcommittee is working on this, so that we can start thinking about these things. We understand that it's not going to happen overnight. So